was that it's also a question of one's approach to archaeology. And I start this talk with what is deemed to be the first ever proper aerial photograph of an archaeological site in this country in 1906, taken by a balloon. As you all know, flying effectively was invented on or powered flight was invented on December the 16th or 17th, 1903. But this was 1906, taken by an army balloon. And what the other reason for showing this slide is that it also helps show, well, it shows two things. One is our approach to archaeology is very site-based. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism, because you've got to start somewhere. But all sites sit in a landscape, as you know from Flag Fen, but also look at the state of Stonehenge. This is part of an army training centre. The Salisbury Plain was bought by the army in 1898, and the army really didn't know what to do with Stonehenge, but they drove all across it. It wasn't until it was taken into guardianship and protected, even though it was still in private hands, because although the army owned Salisbury Plain, this little bit they didn't own, but they were allowed to use it. But the other thing to notice is, look what's happening here. You've got all those wooden stays holding up the stones, and rather dramatically on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1899, one of the stones fell down, as if it was a kind of end of millennium, end of century problem. And the site-based approach, still to this day, the first ancient monument act was 1882, still to this day dominates what we do in archaeology. Just wanted to show the kind of aircraft that there would be in 1919. The First World War helped develop both aircraft technology in a massive way, but also the development of photography. So when you think the first photographs taken were in 1840, and people played with it, but it was really the First World War where it went from being something that was artistic and interesting, but the First World War really transformed it. They were taking these large cameras up, and then some of the aircraft, they actually had processing of the glass negatives in the aircraft. So you could do it, you know, we think digital photography is fantastic because you've got the thing there and then. They were actually doing that in the First World War with glass negatives. Can you believe it? Many of them were destroyed, the photographs. Many survived in what's called the Box Collection at Duxford in the Imperial War Museum. The Americans took the most number of their photographs, but the richest nation on earth decided in 1960, and then this is politics again, was that because of the silver content on all the photographs, they would actually get rid of them and dissolve it to get what, maybe a few ounces of silver. And if we had those photographs now, imagine what that collection would be worth in terms of the information it contains. I've shown this slide many, many times in lots of my lectures, but I wanted to do this through the lens of an aerial archaeologist, if you like, which is, and it hadn't really occurred to me, how important, in a sense, the personal relationships was. So any of you who've done any courses on aerial archaeology, I would hope you've heard of Wessex from the Air, Crawford and Keeler. Now, Crawford is the founder in many ways, the father of not just aerial archaeology, but also field survey. Alexander Keeler was a very wealthy, rich man through his family jam making and marmalade making in Dundee, and he bought Avebury, as you do. He liked aeroplanes, fast cars and women, and he would go skiing in the winter and just dig in the summer. But he also funded Crawford to go flying. And Crawford was obviously a man of taste, because he goes flying not just with one bottle of wine, but 2 bottles of wine. Why that would be, I'm not sure, but he did. And so this survey was effectively funded by Keeler. Now, Crawford's background was he went to Oxford to study classics, decided it was too boring, and did geography. And through having done geography, the First World War happened, but he already knew the potential of aerial archaeology before the First World War, and he ended up as an observer in charge of all the maps of northern France, but an observer to observe what was happening and report back. And that gave him a fantastic background. And what he did, because of that background, was say, look, the air photograph Yes, you've got to have the right light, you've got to have the right conditions, but actually the photograph on its own is actually useless. What you've got to have is the interpretation. And that's another theme that I wanted to thread through the talk, which is actually this: everything we do is about interpretation. And every day while you're digging, you're making interpretations. Every moment of every day you're making interpretations and judgments. Some of them will be right, some of them will be changed, some of them will be wrong. The moment you put it on a piece of paper, somehow it gets a credibility. And it becomes, if you like, the truth. But there is no truth. Everything on there, I mean, you could argue that you're not going to question that that isn't the River Stour. Yeah, okay, it's the River Stour. But somebody else might have another name for it. Crawford's interpretation was that this part of this hill fort, which is Hod Hill in Dorset, and we know that the Romans came and set up their thing because it says so in the texts. But Crawford's interpretation is that this was ploughed in the mid-19th century and that these are actually Iron Age hut circles. Now, we don't actually know that's true because we've never dug it, but it probably is true. It may well be, I mean, one of the other interpretations is that Hod Hill wasn't quite finished. You see these things here, where they're obviously scraping away to build the bank, and then the Romans arrive. And a lot of the Iron Age people get killed. So we could probably spend the next 20 minutes discussing just that one photo and that one interpretation. Everything is an interpretation, and everything I tell you tonight is my interpretation of how I've interpreted what it is I've seen. And so you should question it, and I hope you do.
I'm going to question it.
Good.
How do you feel about the whole Ian Hodder interpretation at the Trowel's Edge thing?
How long have you got? Can we come out at the end?
Yes.
Because it is, you know, I mean, Ian, that was the other thing at Cambridge. I was lucky enough to be in a department, having come from Manchester, to be thrown then into, and Manchester was very much what I would refer to as traditional archaeology. You learnt how to dig, you learnt your dates, you learnt your Rome. I mean, I could cite all the Julio-Claudian emperors. I can't now, but I could then. But actually, did it mean anything? What was great about Cambridge was Ian was there, Glyn Daniel was just retiring, Colin Renfrew was coming. There was a fantastic debate going on in archaeology, which I hope there still is, about what is interpretation, what does it, exactly those questions of whose interpretation is it that we follow now. We'll return to it later. In the people theme, I just wanted to mention this guy, Derek Riley, because Derek was a really good archaeologist, and throughout the late 30s, and I'll show you a picture later, he would do archaeology on his own, on his bike in Lincolnshire, finding flints, making fantastic records. The war happens, and the war happens because of politics. Derek gets put in some really nasty aeroplanes called Whitleys, does 75 bombing missions as a pilot, and at the end of the war he's given a Mosquito, and this is one of the few pictures of his wartime efforts with his navigator, and the Mosquito at the end of the Second World War was part of the Pathfinder, so they could get further and bomb even further. Derek then, after the war, was offered a job as an inspector of ancient monuments with the government, but he turned it down and worked for British Steel, and came back into archaeology in the 70s. Got his private pilot's licence and flew for many years, not only in this country but also in Europe, and transformed in a way, well no, it definitely transformed our understanding of the archaeology of Yorkshire, without a doubt, through his work both on the ground and in the air. And Derek was a great influence on me and others, as you will see, in terms of the people we meet. He died in about 1995, aged about 78 or 80, but he did leave a diary which nobody has ever done anything with, but one day we will, because he wrote a diary of every mission that he flew on during the Second World War. Now, it was illegal for him to do it, because they said you don't keep diaries, but Derek was an absolute inveterate note-taker, and his notes from the 1930s are fantastic, but his diary is just, he tells some wonderful stories of being in particularly one in an electric storm coming back from Germany, and they flew across these white cliffs, and they thought they were Flamborough Head. And then there's a kind of pause in the diary, and he never ever would have a bad word to say about anybody. But so when he referred to people he didn't like, he'd call it, you know, Navigator X or Co-Pilot Y, and he wouldn't give them their names. We could work out their names, and they discovered that actually they were over the White Cliffs of Dover. They were that far off course, and eventually that night they landed at the wrong airbase just off the BA1, and it was an army airbase, and they wouldn't let them take off again until dawn, and they wouldn't give them breakfast because they were RAF guys. And he thought these guys had just been trying to, you know, defend their country, and that's just one little snippet. The other thing I wanted to mention, although I know the dog doesn't like archives, was archives. And the point about archives, if we never ever take another air photograph, there's still enough information in archives that already exist to help us. We discovered an archive taken by a company called Hunting's Aerofilms, and it's now, the oblique collection is now in the care of English Heritage in Swindon. And if you're interested, have a look on there's a website called Britain from Above. And there's a combination between English Heritage, the Royal Commission in Scotland, the Royal Commission in Wales, and HLF, we helped fund it. They're cataloguing all the older photographs from aerofilms that started taking pictures in 1919. And they're cataloguing the first set. On the back of that, there just happened to be about 500 pictures of both Egypt and Jordan, which hopefully we will be able to catalogue as part of our project. So archives incredibly important. This is also a very important archive. This is an old slide, because what was the Cambridge University Collection of Air Photographs, QCAP, from 1945 right up to about 2000, became the unit for landscape modelling. Partly because the University of Cambridge said, why are we the only university in the world to have an aeroplane and an air photo department? And they asked all the people, and we said, because it's a brilliant thing to have, and to be unique means you're a world leader. They said, well, it's got to earn its keep, and they put it under the Department of Geography, and the particular person in charge thought he knew how to run an air photo thing, and he didn't, and it's all collapsed. But the Cambridge University collection is being resurrected. It is available online. But it's all the work of this man, J.K.S. St. Joseph, and then his sidekick, David Wilson. If anybody's interested in air photo interpretation, that's the Bible. First published in 1980 about, or 82. That's the Bradford edition. It was republished in 2002 by Tempest. But it was really St. Joseph, commonly known as Holy Joe, who created it. He, if you go back to politics, he started life as, I think, a geologist, an entomologist, and then during the war was asked to do the air photo interpretation. So they trained him as an air photo interpreter to look at all the post-bombing raid. After the bombing raid, they'd send a reconnaissance team out, and he would look at those air photographs. And he had exactly the right mind for doing that kind of thing. But his love of life was Roman archaeology. So he was able to transform, through the Cambridge University collection of air photos, our understanding, first of all, of Roman archaeology, but then on the back of that, prehistoric archaeology, medieval archaeology, industrial archaeology, the whole world. And interestingly, again in terms of linking people and places, who was his first pilot in 1945 on the 1st of July? None other than Flight Lieutenant Derek Riley. So even though Derek was still flying in the 40s, he gave it up for 30 years and then came back to it in the 70s. So again, it's all those interconnections that are really important. Crawford wrote to Derek and sent him a copy of his book that he'd written in the 1930s, which was, if we just go back to that slide, you see the aerial survey and archaeology. Crawford published that in German in 1938, and there were 5,000 copies produced, and they were held in Southampton in the Ordnance Survey. And Crawford said we should move all our photos and all our plans and all our publications out of Southampton because the Germans will bomb them. And sure enough, the German edition of that was destroyed. There are only a few copies left. Were destroyed in that raid. But it just showed that we were on the edge of a European movement right at the beginning of the Second World War. Whoops, too many. I just wanted also to mention John Hampton, because John was the founder of what is now part of the National Monuments Record National Collection of Air Photographs. You had the Cambridge collection, which was a brilliant collection, but John also knew, and John was working at the Ordnance Survey in the Archaeology Division. Now Crawford had set up the Archaeology Division, so every time you look on your map, your Ordnance Survey maps at the archaeology, that's because of Crawford. John continued that tradition, and it was to use air photographs as interpretive documents so that you could see what archaeology was there. But John also knew that you had people like Derek Riley, Jim Pickering, Arnold Baker, ex-pilots or ex-RAF pilots who were still taking photographs. And he said we need to bring all their photographs together because they contain really important information about the archaeology, because although St Joseph was the only man going around and photographing archaeological landscapes and sites, these other people had been doing it and no one had brought them together. Most of these collections were hidden under a bed somewhere. So John brought it all together and then started looking at the photographs, and he realised they weren't that good because they were nice pictures and they showed the picture in a nice oblique way, but you couldn't make a plan of it, because to make a plan of it you need to get above the site, which are not nearly as good. So John then decided, this was in 1965, John said, right, we're going to have our own flying programme, and I'll come on to that flying programme in a minute. And that's just an aerial view of Swindon. Also to make the point that actually photographing modern towns, they change dramatically over time. Again, politics. The Great Western Railway Works were closed by Maggie Thatcher for no other reason than they thought that she thought they would never ever make money. Because they were a nationalised organisation, nationalised because of the Second World War, but in fact represented a fantastic resource that this country has now lost. And what it's lost is the ability to build railway engines and railway coaches. So all this boom now that we've got in railways, actually all the coaches that are made are not made in York, Swindon or Derby as they used to be, they're made abroad and imported. And it's such a shame, because what's happened now is you've got the National Trust headquarters, you've got English Heritage headquarters here, there's the archive of something like 6 million artefacts. This is now a shopping outlet centre. This is some dreadful flats, but you've also got here Brunel's vision for the Great Western Railway Company, which was to build a village. In 1840, because this is the first ever railway line, public transport railway line in the world, he realised to make this happen you needed to have a complete new town. Brunel didn't just design the railway and the engines and the bridges and everything else, he designed the village. And many of you, I don't know how many people here have ever been to Swindon. Some people have been and passed through. It's worth stopping, the train station's down here, and just walking through this 1840 village. It's a fantastic, it's owned now by the council, and their council houses, but they're tiny. And he built the whole, there's a church, there's a cricket pitch, a recreation area. It's a fantastic story. Again, we spend all the time talking about that, but we won't. As we were talking about people, places and politics, I wanted to show you one of my first ever aerial photographs from February 1977. I was lucky enough to be able to go into aeroplanes from about the age of 10. My uncle, who was in fact not very much older than me, got a scholarship to learn to fly before he could drive. So he joined the Air Squadron at London University when he was 17, and he had his pilot's licence before he could drive. Now, his elder brother, my dad, thought, well, if my kid brother can fly, then I can learn to fly. So my dad, aged whatever he was, 38 or 40, decided in 1966 he'd learn to fly. In 1966 I was 10 years old, so I was sitting in the back thinking, well, this is quite fun. And we can see some archaeology. This is the Roman fort at Broome in Cumbria. There's the medieval castle. It's a dreadful photograph, but you've got to start somewhere. When I put the picture of Barry in there, because my father was in a flying group, and Barry got in touch with him, and with the group, and said, look, I want to do some aerial archaeology in Cumbria, because I'm interested in the western extension of Hadrian's Wall. Barry had a theory that Hadrian's Wall carried on further west than even where we thought, and actually he was right. So again, research question. So he used to fly with him. My father took him flying, and he said, oh, by the way, my son's interested in archaeology, he's going to go to Liverpool University. And Barry rang me up, and I was age 17, And when the professor of a university rings you up and you're age 17, you sort of do what they tell you. If only I'd known better. Barry said, look, you can't go to Liverpool, you've got to go to Manchester. So again, you think you're in control of your destiny, but you're not. Barry was the only professor of archaeology that I know that did any course in aerial archaeology. And in 1975, he gave us a reading list that was even double spaced, didn't fill one page of A4. So you could read every book on the reading list. Now, I bet any of you that are at university, if you're given a reading list, you'll be lucky if you get to read 10% of what's on the reading list. But in those days, that was it. And then I took another photograph, also in 1977, but it is all about the light. You can tell that the window wasn't open because I've got a little reflection, but that's the Roman fort near Wigton in Cumbria. And until Barry started taking these photographs, they didn't know, or nobody discussed, the fact that a lot of these forts had civil settlements with them. And that's been a development, because it was all about the military archaeology. And that was one of the sense the downsides of St Joseph was it was very much about the military archaeology. Barry and actually Crawford were much more interested in, as it were, the people. And you can see how the modern road there continues all the way through that track, and probably carries on, and for some reason they did a diversion, for whatever reason it might be. We're not sure.
A question?
Yes?
What percentage of those kinds of settlements outside of, for example, Roman forts, do you think that we know about as a result of aerial photography only?
Well now, if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, I would have said virtually all of them were known as a result of aerial archaeology. What's happened, because of the developments in geophysics, where there's a hint of them from aerial archaeology, they've now done these massive geophysical surveys, so probably now we know the most detail of these through geophysics. So there's a fort at Maryport, which is 15 miles further west from here. We had no idea it had a vicus until the geophysics people said, look, there must be a vicus. They didn't know where it was, because it's a very, very complicated site. This is relatively flat and easy, but Maryport is really constrained. So they just did geophysics on the off chance of the areas around, and suddenly they're there in geophysical glory with the vicus settlements. Some of them, I mean, this would have been known because of field survey, but until these photos were taken in the late 70s and early 80s, the extent of them, I mean, Barry was really excited when he saw that, and it didn't take much to get Barry excited because he was Welsh, but when he got the job as Professor of Archaeology at Manchester, he was very young, he was one of the youngest professors. He rang his mother up and said, I've just been made Professor at Manchester. She said, oh, Barry, when are you going to get a proper job? Now, I've mentioned the Iran, half through the talk there are bits that I wanted to just make sure that I've already mentioned the Iran-Iraq war. And I've said research, bad luck or opportunity. Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. And this is where we get to, as it were, Flag Fen. Not quite yet Flag Fen. This is, I don't know how clear that is. It's not as clear as it's clearer on my screen because it's a bit. Can we have the lights off just to might make it better. Just.
I'll get it.
This again is going back to the 1980s when. Is that better? Yeah. When they decided that they needed to do a Fenland survey. So that is David Hall, of Fenland survey fame. There is a round barrow here. Can you see that slightly lighter?
Yes.
That's David Crowther. I think that's Francis. There are other pictures I'll show you that. But they were doing effectively a drain survey. I think it was called the Fenland Drain Survey. And they would just clear the sides of drains to see where a drain had cut through archaeology. And you can see here the difference, can't you? You see that there? Mm-hmm. The difference in soil, that's a barrow, and then the ditch on the other side. So this is where you get a bit of Flag Fen. Now, that is David Crowther, you may not know, but that's Maisie. And I was hoping Francis and Maisie might have, because I don't know who this lady is here. But I'll send them this and ask them. That's another picture of Maisie in the hat. So this was 1980. Now it said on the board somewhere that it was 1982. So I'm going to have to double check my slides, because you know when they're old Kodak slides and it prints on them what the date was. And I'm sure when I scanned these it said 1980. Because it said that was when Francis tripped over a thing. So if it was 82, then I'm wrong and Kodak are wrong. But I thought, but this was the first time that the bits of wood were found. Now maybe there's something else, and it took 2 more years to actually find Flag Fen, because it was a long time ago, 32 years. There's a bit of wood. You're probably on board with seeing bits of wood, so I won't dwell on that. There were other interesting things going on in the ditches as well. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see it better on this one. It's a fish. But I only just spotted this one. He's got a tape measure to measure the fish. I think it's a baby pike, and I can't remember his name, but I want to say it's Bob Bourne, but I don't know if it is. That's David Gurney, who is the county archaeologist in Norfolk. I must email him that picture. He's going, what? That big? And then, of course, there's the great man himself, Francis. Doesn't look any different now, does it? Not a bit. And these, I guess these are, I don't know, bits of wood sticking out.
Wow.
But I will have to double check the date, because it was only seeing that board in the interpretation hall that made me think it says 1982. But I was sure when I dug these pictures out on the slide it said 1980. And it may be that this isn't Flag Fen as we know it, but it was bits of wood that were sticking out of the drain. And it was then in 2 years' time that actually Francis realised that this joined up with what became Flag Fen. And that may well be it. But it was the wood that drew us out there. So when Francis said earlier, when we bumped into him in the field, Bob was one of his first students. I wouldn't necessarily phrase it like that, but I know what he means. I was a student at Cambridge. He was desperate for a workforce, and he sort of ran, because he'd come and give us lectures and stuff. He rang up and said, "Help! I need somebody to come and do some work." So Roger Thomas, myself, and Mike Parker Pearson would pop out at whatever time we could get away, or somebody who had a vehicle, because in those days we didn't have cars. Actually, getting out here wasn't as easy as it is now. Now, I can't remember why I put this in, except for people, places and politics. Oh, that's right, it was kind of autobiographical in that having, and that's why they ran it, well, having not been able to do my PhD on Paleolithic archaeology, and having, as I said earlier, asked Barry if I could use his air photographs of the Solway Plain, he said, "Come to Libya." Well, this slide is the first time I've actually seen this slide rather than a darkened image. This is late at night in the Libyan desert, and Barry's got a puncture, because he decided not to go on the road. I mean, there weren't roads, there weren't tracks, but to go straight across the limestone scarp. And the limestone there has these amazingly vertical, as all limestone does, or the hard limestone, vertical features that have been windblown by the sand or whatever for millennia, and they're really sharp. So you're bound to get a puncture. So I said to Barry, "All right, well, I'll help you change it, and I'll take a photo, but I'm walking back to camp because I'm not coming in the car with you anymore." I think you forget him. And there's just another picture of him. And the reason I show this is that they're doing an exhibition of Manchester archaeologists, and they said, "We don't have any pictures of Barry." Because sadly Barry died aged 59 climbing a mountain in Wales, when he was just about to retire and do all his publications that he hadn't done. So this is Barry in 1980. That is Professor David Mattingly, for anyone who's interested. Sadly, that's John Daw, sadly no longer with us. That's Hugh Coddington, county archaeologist for Oxfordshire. Is he still in Oxfordshire?
Yeah.
Maybe. Got some stories to tell about Hugh. Rob Burns, who I think works for English Heritage now in the Newcastle office. Can't remember his name, but he was a Geordie, and that was me in 1980. So that's how I ended up doing prehistoric and for some reason I put my middle name in. Now, in those days, remember what I said about Stonehenge? It was all site-based. And this research was done from 1980 to 1984, and my question was, and partly the question that came into my mind was, having worked with Barry in Cumbria, Barry's view of Cumbria was everything in the Solway Plain was Roman. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why is it we've got so many Bronze Age artefacts, so many Neolithic artefacts, and we don't know anything about the settlement patterns, but we've got all these aerial photographs showing all these little squiggles, and you're not telling me they're all Roman, Barry. But Barry's view was you started with the Romans and everything happened to the Romans. My view was absolutely not. There had to be stuff before, because if there was nobody there, why were the Romans interested? And eventually I was able to tell the story of what actually happened. But, you know, I said everything was interpretation. Well, having got my PhD, hoping that I could then carry on and do more research, because my wife had a really good job and I really didn't need to work. John Cole said to me, but I knew it wouldn't last for long. John Cole said, look, English Heritage is about to be created and there are 4 jobs going, why don't you apply for one of them? Unbeknown to me, somebody had had a word with him and said, do you know anybody who could apply for these jobs? John probably put my name forward, and I said, no, I'm not going to. He said, and he kind of metaphorically grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and said, look, apply for these bloody jobs, because it's very rare that you can get a job which will actually create a career in archaeology. So I applied for the job and I got it, and the 3 other people who got the jobs were Roger Thomas, Mike Parker Pearson, and a guy called Bob Smith, who was an ex-Fleet Air Arm pilot, who, unbeknown to us at the time, wasn't very well, and 2 years later died of cancer, which was a real tragedy. But it gave me what you might call a career. I then moved from English Heritage to the Royal Commission, and as you all know, then the Royal Commission in England was merged with English Heritage, and I ended up being head of aerial survey. And the reason for telling you all this is 2 things. One is everything we do in archaeology is teamwork. And that's what's changed. It used to be the grand old men, the St Josephs, the Barry Joneses, the Mortimer Wheelers, doing archaeology. The reason I showed the 2 pictures, that's how many people it took to get a balloon in the air. That's why ballooning was not that easy to do, and that's why even today airships are not that good to do, because you need an awful lot of people to hold onto the ropes, either to let it go or to grab it. So in the 1880s, right up until they had powered flight, that's how many people you needed to get a military balloon in the air. That's how many people you need if you want to do a mapping project to map all the archaeology on all the air photographs that exist in England. And these guys have been doing it since 1988, and luckily, despite all the cuts and everything else, again politics, which I'll come on to in a minute, they've managed to survive, because what they're doing is providing information to allow archaeologists and students and researchers to do their job in a much more informed way. And the meeting I had this morning in Oxford was to talk to Oxford University about their project, which is to bring all the information from what's called the National Mapping Programme, which I've got a slide of in a minute, bring it all together to try and understand it to take all the data from the Middle Bronze Age right up to Doomsday, to try and see how, and it is only for England, how England's landscape has been transformed from the Bronze Age, and what that transformation is, because you've got peaks and troughs and changes in settlement and changes in environment, and that's going to be a really interesting project. Just a little bit about crop marks. Francis Pryor always used to say, when I was a student a long time ago, when he was digging Fengate, that everything you can see from the air in terms of crop marks represents 5% of what's there. Now if you look at that slide, this is in the Upper Thames Valley, and I think it's the village of Kempsford. We're just up off the floodplain, and you can see it's gravel, it's the lighter soils here because of this lighter colouring here. A whole range of stuff. If that's 5% of what's there, then there's fantastic archaeology beneath those. Whether those are protected or not, I can't say. Some may be, some won't be. But if you were to look at a map of the whole of the Thames Valley, there are more fields with archaeology in them than not. And it's a phenomenon. For those of you who are new to crop mark archaeology, basically whenever a ditch is dug and fills up with any material, doesn't matter what the material is, generally that material will have more water and more nutrients. So that particularly in a dry summer, and this was a dry summer in March, it then got wetter. We had the driest March for a long, long time. And do you remember the temperatures in March getting to 25 degrees? It was fantastic. So there were lots of crop marks in March this year, and then April, May and June happened. But in a year, what happens is the crop grows taller and ripens later above a ditch and above a pit. So it stays greener for longer. So if you just go back to that slide there, that's what's happening there. You've got a ditch there, and it will take longer to ripen. When it does ripen, you can still see a difference because it's higher. The opposite happens when you have a wall, because the roots of the crop go down to the wall, there's less water, fewer nutrients, so this ripens sooner. So that's why you get this phrase, positive crop marks and negative crop marks. It's as simple as that, although it isn't when you get onto grass and chalk and everything else, but don't worry about that. But interestingly, Martin Barber, who's written the book on the history of aerial photography, discovered this, which is the 1890s. This is the same field, and there it is taken in 14th of June 1995, which was a bumper year. But in the 1890s, the antiquaries had people who went out in the field and actually could see the crops standing in the field, measured them, drew a plan of them, which must have taken forever. Because, and I guess the fields were quite big, but when you begin to study how accurate that is as a representation, so those are those ring ditches there, those are those there, that's that complex here. They've slightly got that wrong, but we'll forgive them because they were actually walking through the crops to measure it. How they did it, we don't really know, but they must have used radian poles, measuring, it must have taken forever. Now, you could map that in a day using computer transformations, but it shows how important it was. Just want to mention John Bradford, one of the forgotten people in aerial archaeology. Anybody wanting to read a really good book, not only about the history of the world, or certainly history of Europe, but also aerial archaeology, I recommend this. It's a fantastic read. John Bradford got into aerial archaeology at the end of the Second World War because he was stationed in southern Italy in the army, and he was involved in photography. But he was interested in archaeology, and perhaps had even studied archaeology. But here you can see he was university demonstrator and lecturer in the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, so a lot of his photographs are still there. But he was able to find those fantastic, huge Neolithic enclosures in the Tavolieri di Foggia, southern Apulia, and it's the aerial archaeologist's paradise. When we die and go to heaven, it'll be somewhere floating above the Tavolieri, because you've got everything from Neolithic, very early Neolithic, right through Roman, medieval, and industrial archaeology, and it's just fantastic. And then when you land, you're in Italy, and you can drink their wonderful wine and eat their gorgeous food. It's fantastic. The only problem with Foggia Airport is that it only has one runway, and there are two winds that blow in that part of the world, and one is north-south, and that's fine, and the other is east-west. But the east-west one is a stronger wind, so if you have to take off when the wind's in the north, and then land when the wind's in the west, you are stuffed. And I nearly did crash an aeroplane one day there, but I survived to tell the tale. But that's a really good read, because what Bradford does is take the photograph and then the landscape and does an interpretation. And his interpretation of the Neolithic is that he turns the Mediterranean, whenever we look at a map of the Mediterranean, we always look at it north-south. He turns it on its head and puts the Holy Land at the top. And if you draw a line all the way from the Holy Land, and the first point you would land is southern Italy. And what was happening in the Neolithic, we know, was a huge increase in population, and it probably was just a series of people coming from, what is now Palestine and Levant, and just sailing west, hitting Italy and saying, well, here's a nice place, we'll live here. But we haven't done the research to actually follow it up. The other thing he said in the book is that, and it was written in the late 40s, although it wasn't published until the 50s, most of it was written in the late 40s, was that the future of aerial archaeology will be in both Italy and on the Adriatic coast. This is some of the quality of the imagery of Dalmatia, the Dalmatian coast, which is now Croatia, Slovenia and that area, showing the Roman centuriation and the Roman field systems. And what Bradford was saying was, you archaeologists have got to get and do this work. What he hadn't banked on, this comes back to politics, was that this would be part of the Soviet Union, and from 1946 right up to 1992, nobody in the former countries of in the countries of the Soviet Union could get in an aeroplane and take photographs with a map. When the wall came down, Czech, Hungarian, Polish archaeologists came, they beat a path to our door and said, we need you to teach us what you've done, because Otto Brasch, who was the main man in Germany, said that effectively he'd been flying half blind. And he used to show distribution maps of West Germany, all the work he'd done, and then nothing in East Germany. But of course, archaeology knows no boundaries. The archaeology was all there. So it took 50 years. And it was through conferences like this one here, October 1992, and this one, which was in Potsdam in 1994, to really help build that expertise. Other interesting sideline, this publication was, that conference was 1992, that conference was 1994, that was published in 1995. This, as you will see, if you can see carefully, wasn't published till 1999. And the reason was the French and the Belgians couldn't agree as to who was going to pay for it. So all the work was there, sitting, waiting to be published. And we were saying, we can't publish the Potsdam conference before the Amiens conference, which was in honour of Roger Agache, but the Belgians and the French just would not agree on who was going to pay for it. And in the end, I think some benefactor was taken. And this is just to show you what's happened. I'm afraid it looks a little bit like a bombing campaign, doesn't it? It shouldn't, but a Polish guy, Wojciech Ramczkowski, and I published this to just show where we are at in terms of people doing either reconnaissance, which is that, or mapping, which is where you've got the M, and there are more and more doing the mapping. But an interesting story in terms of politics from both Poland and from Belgium, which is, and we come on to this at the conclusions, which is the biggest barrier to trying to understand archaeology on a landscape scale is actually intellectual rather than anything else. We've done a whole series of training courses across Europe, funded by the European Commission, and we did one in Hungary in 1995. The chief archaeologist from Poland came on the course, which was actually incredible. It would be like Simon Thurley going on an air photo interpretation course. And this guy, Zbigniew Kobylinski, he was like God in Poland. He was quite young, but he was the top man. When he went back and started saying what he'd learnt on the course to his inspectors, some of his inspectors said, yes, we want to have a course in Poland, which we did. But the people in charge of the archaeology there sacked him because they said he was undermining site-based traditional archaeology. So he's now, instead of being Conservator General, he's a professor of the Academy of Sciences and gone into academia. But that just shows you that we never thought of aerial archaeology as being particularly subversive, and in some ways it is, because you see things you perhaps shouldn't do, but clearly the intelligentsia in Poland did not like what he was doing. Equally in Belgium, there's a guy called Jean Bourgeois, who's a prehistoric archaeologist. He found a ring ditch in a part of Belgium where you don't find ring ditches. So he went to see one of his top professor guys and said, look, I think we've expanded our distribution of Bronze Age sites in Belgium. How about we go and excavate it? This guy absolutely refused to let him apply for money, do anything. He said, no, there is no way that's a Bronze Age ring ditch. So with his own money and his own team, he went down and excavated the site, found the Bronze Age pot and said, look, put it on his table and said, there it is. That proves that actually what we know from site-based archaeology is only a part of the picture, and you've got to use all the evidence available to you. That's just an example of some of the archaeology you get in East Europe, particularly East Germany, huge big fields, which, unlike in West Germany where there are smaller fields, you can actually, it's the one advantage of them having stripped away their medieval field system, you can actually see the archaeological sites in all their entirety. We will move on from that one. I also wanted to raise the point about everything we do is also about discovery. And whenever you want to do anything like you're doing this week, these 2 weeks, 3 weeks at Flag Fen, there's an awful lot of serendipity. You don't know what you're going to find. You've got to wait for the right conditions. And a friend of mine that I was working with in Jordan said, oh, when you're back in England, could you go and photograph Blue Burton Hill? And I said, yes, I will do if you can tell me where it is. And it's on the Wiltshire-Oxford border, so it wasn't far from where I was flying. And the day I took off, it was a beautiful sunny day, but I knew that there was a line of cloud moving away from where I was. And I was thinking, I bet you it just doesn't move far enough on the day to be able to photograph Blue Burton Hill. But by about a mile, it did. This happens to be the village where Tim Henry lives. That's completely irrelevant. And when you're flying along at 100 miles an hour, you think, that cloud's not going to move, not going to move. But luckily, it did. And then we were able to show it in a sense, in all its glory. But it's obviously a hill fort that's been very well mashed about, hasn't it? These look like medieval lynchets rather than any, and that must have been the original ditch around it. It's what I like to call a typical southern England type hill fort, well manicured and mashed about. But it's only just luck. And another example here of the serendipity of what we do. Most Roman marching camps, as you all know, but if you don't, most Roman marching camps are in the north, because that was where the Romans had the biggest problem. So what is this doing? I'll just highlight it for you. This is a Roman camp found in 2010 just near Bradford Forum in Dorset. Must be one of the very earliest Roman camps. Let me just highlight the outline again, because we know the Romans were there at a very early time. So probably there are many more Roman camps to be found. And is it that we haven't found them because we haven't looked for them, or is it that actually there were fewer of them because when the Romans came through, there wasn't a problem? I just show this one because this is now becoming quite well-known Roman fort at Whitley Castle in County Durham, partly because of the advance in techniques in terms of geophysics, everything else. When my father and I were flying around this one, I was looking at the Ordnance Survey map saying, well, it must be there somewhere, but I couldn't see it. So I took the photos, and then I got my eyes in. Because you've got snow in ditches, and these are field systems, and the Roman fort's here, and it's multiple ditched, because clearly it was hard to defend. And that's, to me, that's one of the most confusing aerial photographs I've ever taken or ever had to use, because it's actually very, very difficult to interpret. As a piece of art, it's lovely.
That's the one on private land, isn't it?
I don't. Well, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't
they
know.
own it, and they're trying to turn it into a tourist attraction, or actually sell the land off with the fort on it as like added value for real estate.
Yeah, well, that's a detail I don't know, but yeah. There's a big archaeological survey going on, isn't
there? Yeah, the miners
so.
And farmers landscape.
Yeah. I just put that in, which is some people often say, you know, wasn't it handy that they built the Roman road all the way to the airfield? This is the Roman road that joins Exeter with Lincoln, and it just reminded me of a joke which I used in one of my books, which is, I expect you've heard about Roman roads, and these poor Iron Age people are about to get zapped by the Romans, which I love. I also love this, but you know, you've actually got the workmen here. I'll move on from those as time is pressing. I wanted to just pause on this one. This was 1990, again, a quite good hot summer. And in a way, this sums up so much of British archaeology and European archaeology. How are we doing for time? Yeah. Because this is a scheduled ancient monument. This isn't. And this is gravel extraction. But they had to stop here because they couldn't get permission to destroy this. They could, if they wanted to, destroy this. But an English heritage couldn't protect this field, because unless you know that archaeology continues, I mean, the logic says it must continue, mustn't it? Because it's in here, it's here, this is a field of pasture, it's typical Oxfordshire. They don't just have one moated manor house, but two moated manor houses. This is the village of Stanley. But again, it's that site-based approach. Now, they may well have done geophysics, because this was taken in the 1990s. They may well have done geophysics in here, and they were able to say, yeah, there's archaeology in there, leave it alone. But that, to me, is such a good photograph, taken by a colleague, Roger Featherstone, because it summarises what we do and how we value our archaeology. How much was excavated here, we'd have to look at the reports of Oxford University. But the fact that they were allowed permission to go up to here because it wasn't protected. But again, there must have been archaeology in here. It could have been protected. Some of this archaeology is important enough, and so we know some of it dates from the Neolithic, and it's a whole palimpsest. There is also a lot of work needs to be done on how damaging is the ploughing. Because although there would have been banks there, actually once the first plough and first couple of years of ploughing, more often than not, it doesn't do any more damage. And you get a stable layer, and the biggest problem is the dewatering, and the dewatering comes with the extraction from gravel. So we're afraid we've got a long way to go. And again, in terms of politics, I just wanted to raise this, which is this was a survey done in 1960, a matter of time, an archaeological survey. And it was making exactly the same point that I've just made, whoops, if we go back here, which is, as a result of aerial survey and landscape archaeology, we've discovered that there are fantastic, there's a lot of archaeology well preserved in gravel areas. And a matter of time looked at several gravel areas, including the Nene Valley, and worth getting hold of a copy of this book. But the political point is this. The conclusion of that, one of the conclusions is the requirement for continued air survey and air photography at an increased tempo is self-evident. Then, page 46, in the following 15 lines, excavation-related words are used 6 times. What happened as a result of this, 1960, was that the Department of what was the precursor of English Heritage, in those days was called the Inspector of Ancient Monuments and Historic Buildings. They created 3 new posts, and they employed 3 people to do what? Not to do air survey, but to excavate. As if 3 people could actually make a difference. Now, they were 3 very important people, ended up as Jeff Wainwright, Ian Stead, and Brian Davison. All had glittering careers, that's fine, but they didn't actually follow the consequences of what they were going to do. Haven't time to go into Fenland in Roman times or Danebury, except to say, in terms of politics, the reason Danebury's importance to Hillfall is not because it's important to Hillfall, but because Barricone have excavated it. And if you haven't looked at, given that you're digging in the Fens, and that's why I included this slide, well worth having a look at the Fenland in Roman times, because this was one of the first attempts by C.W. Phillips, who ran the Ordnance Survey Archaeology Division, successor to O.G.S. Crawford, to look at what archaeology is in the Fens using air photography. It's hidden away as a Royal Geographical Research Series number 5, partly because the authors, it's edited by C.W. Phillips, the authors actually argued with each other so much. Phillips didn't want it to be published he had to publish it, but he didn't want it published somewhere people could read it. And actually, today, going back to Lisa's point about Ian Hodder, that would be the highlight of this, because actually several of the authors didn't agree, because it's about interpretation. And I think that's a wonderful thing. But in those days it was, oh no, there's got to be some truth. There is no truth. Oh yes, the reason I put that in was, there is no truth. My guys at English Heritage, because of the National Mapping Programme, then had to reinterpret everything I'd done as my PhD. And they said, oh Bob, you got it all wrong. And I said, well okay, that's fine, because you've got new evidence. And their new evidence, if you look at all this, it's very, my PhD, not surprising, was site-based, because I was using individual air photographs that people had taken over 50 years. The cataloguing of the National Collection of Vertical Air Photographs meant they could look at a landscape in much more detail, but then also one flight in 2006 added all that new information. And what that new information showed them was that a lot of these individual sites were actually all interconnected. And if those sites were, as we thought they were, Iron Age, Roman, some are Bronze Age, but actually all interconnected, you're dealing with a landscape. So, but it takes 30 years to build up that picture. I said I'd mention the National Mapping Programme. Isn't time to go into it now, but basically, and that's wrong, it's now 40%, but the National Mapping Programme looks at all the aerial photographs ever taken in England, not in Wales or Scotland, held by both Cambridge and the National Monuments Record, to make maps at a scale of 1 to 10,000, so that both English Heritage can do their protection, but actually the local county archaeologists can also do their research. And Pete Horn, who's now the head of aerial survey, adds in the extra layer in terms of what Hoskins refers to, because you've got, as it were, the natural, even though there's no such thing as the natural, and then the man-made landscape, you've actually got another layer of that hidden landscape which the air photos can give you. and that helps us with our understanding of the making of the English landscape. And when it's completed and the analysis is done.
Is that showing that Cambridge and Peterborough isn't in that area yet?
Yeah, this is a bit of an old map, which is 2006, and I don't think it has been yet, but it would certainly. Some bits have, because in a matter of time, they focused on Maxi and the Nen Valley.
Francis did say that this area hasn't been surveyed.
I'll come on to that in conclusions. And this now gets us into a bit of HLF territory. HLF like to claim this is their slide. I first saw it when I was at English Heritage, so English Heritage claimed it was their slide, but it doesn't matter whose slide it is. But it's a really useful, in a sense, understanding of what's called the heritage cycle. Some people say it should be a helix because it isn't two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. But it doesn't matter where you are on that, whether you start with understanding, but you've got to have the understanding, because if you don't understand it, you can't value it. And if you don't value it, you don't care for it. And if you don't care for it, you can't enjoy it. And in a sense, that's what you're involved with here, just as we're all involved with that at HLF as well. I've spent most of my life both in that area and in that area, but then also by valuing, because valuing can have lots of meanings. And valuing in terms of HLF means the people who actually care about it, but they also value it from a monetary point of view, in that they say to us, oh, can you give us 3 million quid, because we value it. But you can't put a monetary value on anything. But I think the heritage cycle is really interesting, really useful, because it does help you understand A, what we're trying to do on a strategic level, but also where you might wish to end up in your careers and where you might want to be. On that stage, yes, the other connection was, I hadn't realised it, but flying around this, took a picture, and then the guy who I sent it to, who happened to be living in Australia, said, oh, by the way, did you know HLF gave them a grant to understand the hill fort? And so there's a book published about Blueburton Hill, paid for by HLF, unbeknown to me, and they didn't have any aerial photographs, but it was too late by then. I want to finish in the last, literally 5 minutes, on Jordan, because, again, connections. David Kennedy had worked in Jordan with Derek Riley on Rome's desert frontier from the air, using existing air photographs, understanding it by using existing air photographs. David had tried for 20 years to do aerial survey in Jordan, and then one day he met somebody called Tricia Salty. Tricia Salty is English, a classic lady of the 1960s and 70s who went to Jordan to work for the civil service, foreign office or whatever, fell in love with somebody who happened to be a pilot, also then happened to be the only pilot killed in action, and she was pregnant with their son. As a result of that, King Hussein said, Tricia, whatever it is you want, I will give, because we're responsible for your husband's death. When David then got in, they met, and David said, how can I actually convince the Jordanians that they need to help us do aerial archaeology? She said, don't worry, I'll fix it. And sure enough, because David had always gone through the authorities, Tricia had a word with the king had a word with so-and-so, and then sure enough, in 1997, gets in a helicopter. David then emails me, because Derek said, if I'm not around when you start doing aerial archaeology, there's this bloke called Bob Bewley, he's a good chap, why don't you email him? So I get an email out of the blue, having had this Middle Eastern background anyway, from this guy in Australia called David Kennedy, who I met once when he was at Sheffield, and he said, I've got a chance to do aerial archaeology in Jordan, I don't know much about aerial archaeology, can you help? So I replied, is the Pope Catholic? I'll be on the next plane. And since 1998 we've been every year, and this was us in 1998, it's not a very good slide, but the archaeology of Jordan is phenomenal because there are no prop marks. They're all stoneworks, all great big castles or great big Roman stuff. But the key thing about Jordan, which surprised me, and one of the lessons that we've learned throughout Britain and Europe, is that most archaeology is under threat from somebody. And Jordan is about 2/3 the size of England, but has a population of 5 million, so a very small population. Wherever you go in Jordan, you will see the remnants of a bulldozer. No matter how far out. We once drove all day to get to a site, and sure enough, somebody in a bulldozer had driven just because they could for 3 miles, just taking out a whole lot of the basalt desert. and it is phenomenal what's happening. And the few photos I've got of Jordan, and I will leave you a copy of Ancient Jordan from the Air as my little gift to your research project, published in 2004 by Kennedy and Bewley. Just a few pictures to end with. Wonderful, stunning pictures of this site, Les Jeunes in Jordan. And the reason I show that is, again, interpretation. We were there with the Limes Congress in 2000. The Limes Congress is a group of people who study the Roman frontiers, Limes being limit. We stood on this site with the big professor from America who said the reason this site is here because it's on a promontory, it's commanding the views, and it's a very important strategic location. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, we're in a valley, and we're next to a river, and there's two hills either side. It's not in that kind of location at all. And there were military sites on the top. And I said to David, surely this is about economic control. And he said, yes, but don't ask those questions. The Americans like to have their view of how that's interpreted, and that's his interpretation. And I mean, he may not be far wrong, because it's about the fact, but he was actually saying it was on a hill. It wasn't. You can see it's down in a wadi, it's down in a river. But in his mind, he excavated the site. It was on, and he's right. It was in an important location, but it's not on a hilltop. Other sites there. That's a lovely site, Dangineer, small little Roman fort. The Roman reservoir, still in use today, also being fed by a modern reservoir, because obviously the control of water in places like Jordan is absolutely crucial. Most of the sites have earlier remnants here, probably Nabatean, and Nabat in Arabic means to dig for water.
Can I just ask a quick question on this slide? Physically, how big is that Roman site?
Ooh, if I said 150, 200 metres by 200 metres, but that's smaller than the other one.
Yeah.
The other one is much bigger. That's actually quite a small one. And of course, when we were there, how many of you know Tony Wilmot from English Heritage? He created a wonderful song, which is, instead of Long Way to Tipperary, it was A Long Way to Dangineer. And whenever Tony and I meet, we break into song. Just another example of some of the fantastic proper hilltop enclosures. But the reason for showing this is also the destruction that's going on. Lovely little small enclosure, probably a caravanserai, and they're digging, they have now built it, this is about 3 years ago, the M25 round Amman, effectively, the Southern Ring Road, and no archaeological survey whatsoever. The only survey that was done was what David and I could do, unasked and invited, to fly around it several times to record it and try and record some of the sites that were trashed. Haven't time to go into that, but that was down in Aqaba on the south coast of Jordan, and allegedly where Muhammad, this is a Christian settlement, Muhammad arrived just after he decided to create the new religion and said, yeah, you can carry on being Christians, but I'll be back. And he was, but he let them carry on being Christians for many years. Won't go into Umm Rasas. I just wanted to show this. This is a site, again, one of those caravanserai being bulldozed, and if you look very carefully, you've got the Roman reservoir here, and that was the site of the previous site, completely bulldozed. And why? Again, politics. They needed, this was a farmer who was obviously struggling, got a grant from guess where, the European Union, to grow olives in a place that in Jordan you shouldn't grow olives, and everyone says they taste horrible anyway. But he had an EU grant to grow olives to help the economy in southern Jordan, and we flew back. This was in 1999 and 2000. We went back in 2005, and all the olive trees are dead as well. So sites have been destroyed for absolutely no reason at all. I show that one. This is my favourite site, Kazabushir. Have a look in the book, because it actually tells you who built it. Above the lintel there, it says built by Aurelius Asclepiades, 296 to 307 AD. We don't know why. It's either a fort or a Roman governor's palace, but there's a British archaeologist who wants to convert it to a hotel. Oh, please, no. The good thing is you can't get that.
I'm just wondering if we should leave a little time for questions.
Yes, I'm going to just finish. And two conclusions, two slides of conclusions. As I started, never underestimate the value of political nature of relationships as well as the personal. Even the weather forecast is political. We can cover that in questions. People may be different, but the same issues apply in the variety of locations. And as I said earlier, politics, intellectual barriers as much as financial or party political. We won't go into the, as it were, but also, finally, archaeology is also great fun. I will leave it there. And that is one of the training courses we did in Jordan, and this, in a sense, comes back to people, places and politics. Mohammed here is from Saudi Arabia, and after a morning of doing aerial archaeology said, I think everything you taught us is a waste of time. I don't know why I'm on this course. And we said, because it was a 5-day course, and we thought, blimey, that's not a good start. And we said, all right, but just stick with it. And then we took him flying, and at the end of it, we said, right, on the first day, Mohammed, you said you thought it was a waste of time. What do you think now? And he said, when can you come to Saudi Arabia? So I still wait.
I'd just like to add that 3D glasses are an essential item of any archaeological dig. We've got ours too.
Oh, have you? Exactly. There we are. That's it.